Hi everyone. This webinar is specifically aimed at teaching assistants and learning support assistants. My name is Izzie Turner. I have a degree in psychology and I spend one day a week working under the supervision of Dr. Alison DeMario, conducting psychology assistant work. The rest of the time I'm a learning support assistant, so for this webinar I've drawn upon my own experiences of working during the pandemic and the experiences of my fellow LSAs at SJB. Originally, this presentation was designed with a focus on physically returning to work during the pandemic. Despite the most recent lockdown, it still focuses heavily on the idea of being in school and working closely with the children you support, but the advice I give is also applicable if you now find yourself working from home. In this session, we'll be covering a number of things. So firstly, the impacts of COVID-19 on adults, with a particular focus on school staff. We'll also look at what it's like to be a TA during the pandemic, some of the challenges that we've faced and how we've had to adapt our roles to keep ourselves and our students safe. How you can look after your personal well-being in school, some work-related changes that you can make and how to get the best out of in-school support. And then finally, we'll look at some general self-care tips, things that you can work into your day to improve your overall well-being. Before we start, I'd just like you to pause the video and have a think about what well-being means to you. And what do you do to look after your own well-being? If you're watching in a group, which I know is probably unlikely at the moment, this would be a really good opportunity to discuss your thoughts. So what is well-being? By definition, well-being refers to the state of being comfortable, happy, or healthy. Personally, though, I think that the three go hand in hand, and good well-being comes from a combination of all of them. We need to be comfortable, happy, and healthy in order to experience overall well-being. When we have good well-being, it feels as if our lives are in balance, and this enables us to cope with challenges and problems in our daily life and at work more effectively. We feel more positive, motivated, and engaged, particularly at work, and we have an increased resilience when facing difficulties. As TAs, being able to do all of these things is vital. Our jobs don't always run smoothly. They're often stressful, but good well-being means that we can enjoy work and cope with high-pressure situations. Contrastingly, poor well-being negatively impacts upon an individual's work performance, including their ability to manage stressful situations and stay focused, motivated, and positive day to day. We'll take a closer look at some mental health statistics in a little while, but I thought we'd start by looking at this figure, which is taken from the report 10 Steps Towards School Staff Wellbeing, and it was created by the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, which is a great website for resources for school staff and parents and students. It poses the question, how does work affect school staff wellbeing? And of over 1,500 school staff surveyed, only 2% claim that their work has a positive impact all of the time. 23% said often, and the majority, 55%, said some of the time. This actually leaves 19% stating that work doesn't have any positive impact at all on their mental health and well-being. And this research was published in 2018, so it was pre-pandemic. So it's safe to assume that actually the statistics may have changed slightly for the worse in the current situation. And if this is the case, then it's really important that we start addressing why this may be and how we can change it for the better in the future. I know it's a bit of a tall order to assume that work can positively impact everyone all of the time, but it wouldn't be unrealistic to hope that more people can fall into the often category. In June 2020, approximately 1 in 5 adults were reported likely to be experiencing depression of some form during the COVID-19 pandemic. Rates of depression were previously 1 in 10, meaning that they've doubled since the outbreak of coronavirus. Unfortunately, much research into mental health and well-being amongst school staff is heavily focused on teachers. This piece of research, conducted by the organisation Education Support in 2019, so prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, found that 55% of SLT and 49% of teachers reported that their workplace, school, had a negative impact on their mental health and well-being. No specific research has been conducted that I could find, but we can expect to see statistics in a similar range for support staff. Though it could be argued that we have a smaller workload and less responsibilities than teaching staff, support staff, TAs, LSAs, have different pressures and responsibilities to deal with. I've picked out a few here, but if you'd like to pause the video and discuss what challenges you feel you face in your role, now would be a good time. So first of all, we work closely with the most challenging children. They are not always nice to us. They may refuse to work or do as they're told, and can struggle with their own emotions and mental health, which we often have to deal with. When our students struggle, it is a task in itself to detach our own emotions and not allow them to affect our days. In addition to this, many of us take on multiple roles within the department. Lots of you may be ELSAs, phonics support, reading or handwriting coordinators, lunchtime coordinators, the list goes on. Many of you are also key workers for multiple children across multiple year groups and classes, and it can often feel like a juggling act. In spite of this, we have very little time allocated for prep work or any additional work required from us outside of the classroom. I've also noted the difficulties that come from a perceived lower status within the school. As LSAs, we do not tend to have quite as large a voice or presence, and behaviour management is not our responsibility. And as a result, it can feel difficult to discipline or, on occasion, be taken seriously or respected by students. What a lot of these factors boil down to is a sense of a lack of control. And psychological research, including Johansson et al.'s study of Swedish sawmill workers, found that the features of the workplace most associated with stress include low control and high workload. In essence, the more control that we feel in our jobs, the less stress we are likely to experience. But this is not so much an opportunity for me to highlight all the things wrong, in inverted commas, with schools in relation to learning support, but rather to recognise and appreciate that our jobs are difficult, particularly during a global pandemic. This piece of research, conducted by Solari et al. In 2020, highlights the elements of the Covid-19 pandemic that could have an effect on mental health and well-being. Some issues may affect some people more than others, for example, economic problems and the impact of social media and sleeping problems, but highlighted in red are the issues that I feel are directly relevant to us as LSAs, and those are facing great changes and inadaptability, and fear and anxiety for your health and the health of your family. This is probably particularly prominent for those who are still working in school during lockdown. We'll look into these more closely in the following slide. Much like rates of depression that I mentioned previously, rates of stress and anxiety have also increased during the pandemic amongst the general population. This particular review found that almost 1 in 3 people are suffering from these disorders, as can be seen in the figures below the diagram on this slide. And what I want you to take from this information is that if you've been feeling stressed, anxious, or extremely low at times, this is very normal and you're not alone. Being a TA is hard, and being a TA during a pandemic is even harder. I've noted a few of the additional issues that we face here, but this list is not exhaustive and experiences will vary from person to person. So firstly, personal safety. By nature, our roles require us to be in close proximity to students. During the pandemic, we have had to navigate our own personal safety and the safety of the children while still providing exceptional support. Sometimes this requires us to weigh up whether it's more important to carry out our work safely and sacrifice better educational support for the children, and vice versa. But this is not an easy choice to have to make. This issue also feeds into the idea of conflicting instructions. It can sometimes feel as though each staff briefing brings a new set of instructions that conflict everything we are taught as TAs. For some roles within the school, it is easy enough to keep distance from students. Teachers, for example, are instructed to create 2-metre safe zones at the front of their classrooms. And now, during lockdown, many can teach from home via Zoom. Whilst in school, LSAs sit amongst the students, they move between lessons with them, and during the current lockdown, many of us are still required to come in to supervise the key worker and vulnerable children who are in school. Often our role requires us to go against the guidance regarding proper social distancing, which can be quite stressful. Given the current lockdown, we've also had to adapt to new ways of working, be it in school or at home. There is new technology to get to grips with, things like apps and Zoom calls, and we need to come up with ways to keep in contact with our students, as well as ways to keep them supported and engaged in their online learning when unable to be face-to-face. As I mentioned before, in school, we've had to learn how to provide effective support whilst following ever-changing guidelines. Our roles are constantly changing, and we are constantly having to adapt. During the pandemic, absence rates among both staff and students have also been relatively high. Most people at some point have had to take time off, be it completely necessary or simply as a precautionary measure. And this is absolutely okay. In fact, it is vital in these times to play it safe rather than sorry, but that doesn't stop us from feeling guilty about leaving our students or concerned about whether they will receive the support they need in our absence. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, many are experiencing increased fear and anxiety, both in relation to work and in general. For some, it may be a relief to now be working from home, but for others, this may have the opposite effect, and having to change how we work could be more problematic. In many schools, LSAs are being used for in-school supervision and continue to come into school every day. These individuals might continue to feel anxious about the effect this could have on the health and well-being of themselves and their families. I'm just going to go back to the report 10 Steps Towards School Staff Wellbeing and look at the question, which single initiative among the following do you feel would be the most valuable to improving your mental well-being at work? The overwhelming majority of participants, 58%, answered with a reduction in workload. Time off and flexible working schemes came in second with 13% of the vote. Sometimes a straightforward reduction in workload just isn't realistic, although there are things that you can do to help you manage and cope better. In the following slide, we will address the things you can do or utilise at school. But pause the video now and discuss or think about what you're doing currently. There's a really big push at the moment for promoting good mental health in the workplace, and when it comes to looking after your well-being at school, there is help available. None of these ideas that I'm going to share are particularly groundbreaking, but sometimes it just takes a little reminder to let you know that the support is there if you need it. So first of all, supervision. It's a common misconception that your line manager is purely there in a directive role. Remember, it's also their responsibility to provide you with adequate supervision. In many jobs, supervision is a permanent weekly or monthly fixture, but in schools it can feel a lot more difficult to find the time. If you feel you would benefit from supervision, ask for it, and this may be to discuss specific issues or it might just be an opportunity to offload. But whatever it may be, make a specific slot for it in your timetable if you can, or request it as and when you need. If you don't feel that you can comfortably discuss mental health with your line manager, schedule a meeting with a work buddy instead. This is especially important now that some of you may be working from home, and the odd drop-in or catch-up chats can't just happen without proper planning. Ensure that you make time for them when you need them, even if they need to be over Zoom. Next up, make sure that you do not accept work within reason that you know you will not be able to complete to the best of your ability, or that you just don't have the time for. It's okay to say no to things, especially if it will affect other work you have to do. Lots of our students require a lot of attention, and if taking on extra work means that they don't get the support they need, then that's not helpful either. Given the current situation, there are likely to be times when you are pushed outside of your comfort zone. Talk to your line manager if you are struggling to cope with this. Try to minimise the amount of work you take home. As a TA, you shouldn't really have to take any work home, although obviously exceptions do apply in lockdown. In normal circumstances, take time at break or after school to catch up with teachers, send emails and do everything you need to do before you leave. If you're struggling to find the time to do everything, look for potential gaps in your timetable where you'd be better placed to do prep work and discuss this with your line manager. If you're currently working from home, Do not work outside of your usual hours and ensure that you switch off completely when your working day ends. Mute your work emails if you have to. Wherever possible, it is helpful to make your workspace at home different to an area where you would usually relax. Make sure that you also talk to each other. No one will have a better understanding of what you have to deal with at school than the other members of your department. You're all in the same boat, so make sure you talk to each other and check in on each other. And this is more important now than it ever has been before. Finally, be adaptable and flexible around change. The more open-minded and positive you are, the easier it will be to cope with the changes and challenges that you have to deal with, particularly in these difficult times. Try to understand that things won't always run smoothly at the moment, and though we may not always feel in control of what happens, we are in control of how we cope with it. Finally, I'd like to ask you the question, what do you do? I just thought I'd leave you with a couple of resources and extra support should you need it. So the Anna Freud Centre website, which I've referenced a few times throughout the presentation, contains loads of useful information about staff wellbeing. If you go to their homepage and scroll down to I work in a school or college, then you can find lots of resources both for yourself and your students. Both Headspace and Calm app are free, although you can pay for subscriptions to premium versions. They're both tailored to help with meditation and sleep. There's also an app called I Breathe, in which you can set breathing intervals for inhaling and exhaling that can help with breathing practice. This might be particularly useful if you need something immediate to calm you down. Mind also have a very useful page on self-care in everyday living, and you can find this by visiting mind.org.uk. Scroll down and click on information and support, and then scroll down to tips for everyday living, and scroll down again and there's a tab labelled wellbeing where you'll find some useful advice. And finally, if everything does get a little too much, services like Samaritans are always available to talk 24 hours a day. Their number is 116 123 and it's free to call. So thank you so much for listening to this webinar. I really hope you found it helpful, or at the very least it's reminded you that you're not facing this alone. TAs and LSAs are invaluable members of staff, and your hard work doesn't go unnoticed. Just remember, when you feel like you don't have the time or that you shouldn't take the time for yourselves, that by doing so, you will feel better able to provide effective support for your students, and that in itself makes it really worthwhile.